Good afternoon and welcome to our penultimate lecture in our series, Leading Voices in Politics and Policy. My name is Charlie Whelan. I teach the companion course to our lecture series in the Rockefeller Center here at Dartmouth, and I will be returning later to moderate the discussion with our guest. First, I'd like to remind you of our final lecture next Tuesday with Frank Newport, who is the editor-in-chief of the Gallup organization. If you find yourself wondering what America is thinking right now, he's the guy who can actually tell you that. In the meantime, I have the privilege of introducing Carol Folt, our provost and the holder of the Dartmouth Professor of Biological Sciences chair here at Dartmouth. Carol will in turn introduce our guests. Carol?
I'm so pleased today to have the chance to welcome today's leading voice, Mr. Jeffrey Immelt, the chairman and CEO of General Electric and a current member of Dartmouth's Board of Trustees. A few years ago, I was privileged to be a part of a wonderful Dartmouth alumni tradition when I was adopted by the class of 1978. So that gives me the chance to also welcome Jeff as a member of his class, because he is a member of the wonderful class of 1978 at Dartmouth. Jeff, when he was at Dartmouth, he majored in math and econ, and among many activities, he was also a very talented football player, and he even tried out for a time with the Cleveland Browns. He received his MBA from Harvard in 1982, and then he joined GE, where he has been very rapidly risen to the top, becoming chairman and CEO in 2001. As many of you probably know, he's been named one of the world's best CEOs 3 different times by Barron's. He is a familiar and very welcome and generous voice here on campus. He speaks and has been participating in many venues here with students and faculty, always talking about critical and important global issues. He also has sort of amazing timing. In 2004, which was a period of economic concern in the country, Jeff was the Dartmouth Commencement speaker. And at that time, he said to the class, "In times like these, it is always good to remember that there are always times like these." But he also went on to say that the era we live in belongs to people who believe in themselves but are focused on the needs of others. And he said that is being what he calls great and good. And he urged the graduating class to always take on the world's toughest problems by being great and good in a world where the journey really counts. As a member of the board, he always helps us focus keenly on important things like excellence of the place, innovation, strategic thinking, and in particular, the need to be preparing graduates to be part of a complex and rapidly changing global economy. And he always presses us to be both great and good. Under his leadership, GE has been a leader of innovation in a number of areas, including 2 of immense social consequence, healthcare and energy efficiency and new technologies, the latter of which he will address today. And finally, he's never a person who backs away from taking on difficult challenges. So for example, in January, he agreed to be the chair of President Obama's newly created Council on Jobs and Competitiveness. Now that is an important task right now. It's a nonpartisan council that is designed to advise the president on ways to encourage hiring, educating and training American workers to compete in a global economy, and attracting the best jobs and businesses in the world to the United States. So we're so honored today to have Jeff with us, and we look forward to hearing his thoughts on energy and the environment. He is also going to answer questions, and he loves that part of the exercise, so think of lots of good questions to ask him. Please join me in welcoming Jeff Immelt.
Thanks. Thank you. Thanks. It's always great to be back at Dartmouth. There's not much going on in the world, so you know, it's kind of a fun respite to be able to spend some time in Hanover. I don't know if Buddy needs offensive tackle, but maybe I could still go out. I know he's practicing the guys. So what I'm going to do today is just talk a little bit about the energy policy, energy and the environment, talk a little bit about the Jobs Council, and then the most fun is to take questions and let the conversation go wherever it goes. I think energy is something, GE's got about a $50 billion energy business. It is kind of the genesis, if you will, of the company from the standpoint of Thomas Edison and how we started. We're the broadest technology and one of the biggest in the world. For the last, since 2004, we've really focused on clean energy, what we call eco-imagination, to be a big driver of growth and competitiveness. So that's kind of the context that I'm going to give as I talk today about just more broadly energy. I'd say 60% of GE today is outside the United States industrially. So I get a chance to we do business in 120 countries around the world. And I've probably been in my 30-year career in 80 countries, something like that around the world. And one of the pillars of competitiveness always is energy and energy policy. So this is something that's actually quite important in the context of global economy. So what I thought I'd do is just kind of frame the situation a little bit to talk about energy. I always like to show just pictures. This just gives you a sense of how big energy is in the global stage. So this is just a quick snapshot as of 2010 of the number of automobiles in the United States versus China and India. 133 million in the US, roughly 62 million in China and India. And that's a snapshot in 2010. By 2020, there'll be about 300 million cars in China and India, and there'll still be about 130 million cars in the United States. And fundamentally, by 2020, just the automotive industry in China and India will consume all of Saudi Arabia's output of oil. So this is one of the great growth industries. I look at this and say, man, what an opportunity. But I think the extent to which you can think about the price of $1 of gasoline that you pay at the pump, the US is no longer the marginal consumer of energy or the marginal consumer of gasoline. The global price of gasoline is going to get set in places like China. That's where the incremental customer, the incremental consumer is today. So that's just a snapshot of energy and oil. That's number one. This is kind of a snapshot of the world at night today. So if you look at, if you took a satellite over, and pulled together all of the midnight shots, this shows not much of China, none of Africa. The US is electrified, not much of Russia is electrified. This is what it'll look like by 2020. So there'll be about 300 gigawatts of new energy capacity that come online in the next decade. Most of this, again, driven outside the United States, and a lot of it coming from different fuel sources. Gas, natural gas will be a big driver, maybe a little bit of nuclear, not much. Coal will always be a big driver. More renewables, things like solar and wind, will be big players, but just shows you the massive growth in energy. So I think it's always good when you talk about things like energy to just give you a sense for the size and the scope and what some of the drivers are. I think the last thing I'd show you, just by frame of reference and broadly speaking in energy, is just here's what the major economies of the world, being China, or United States, Japan, and Europe, percentage of GDP that's going into R&D and energy. And as you can see in the chart, the US dramatically trails Europe and Japan. And if I put, really the person that's driving most new energy technology today, it's China. So I would just leave you just to set the stage with this, the fact that it's a big market, that it's growing rapidly, that a lot of the growth is taking place outside the United States, and the US, from a relative standpoint, from a competitiveness standpoint, just hasn't invested much in energy of any kind over the past 20 or 30 years. So that's just a backdrop for what I thought I'd talk about today. So with that, I was just, kind of, here's everything I know about clean energy on one page, right? So I don't get out much, as you can tell. So I just, these are the things that I think are the most salient things to know. First, energy markets are huge, and they're dynamic, and they're complex. There's multiple technologies. The stakes are big. Every country's playing. There's lots of different dynamics that are going on from, things like discovery of shale gas, which 5 or 10 years ago, nobody was talking about things like shale gas. You have natural disaster tragedies like Fukushima, which have a long-term impact on the nuclear industry. There's just always something going on in the energy sector, point number one. Point number two, at no time and in no country has energy ever been a true free market. In other words, if you're a utility CEO and you build a plant today, that plant is going to last 50 years. So you have tremendous time dislocations. You have the impact of pollution and what it means from the overall energy sector. You have regulation. You have public utility commissions, which you have automotive standards. And so the point I give you here is that, whereas I'm a free market capitalist, I think when it comes to energy, the government has always had a role in shaping energy policy. The government has always had a role in impacting technologies. The government's always had a role in driving regulation. The government's always had a role in pollution and pollution reduction. And so it's impossible to talk anywhere in energy without also talking about energy policy and the role the government plays in that space. And I guarantee if something like nuclear is going to come back in the United States ever, it's only going to be because the U.S. government wants it to. It's not going to be driven by the private sector. This is a sovereign industry, and that's what will drive it. Point number two. Point number three, technology reigns. And I've always been, I started my career in sales. So my early days working at GE, I was selling plastic in the automotive industry, and so I always noticed it was easier to sell patented products than commodity products. So I've always been a fan of technology because it was easier to sell. So I always think innovation rules, and energy is a place where innovation is going to be tremendously important as time goes on. And I actually would urge people not to pick a favorite technology, but to let lots of different technologies find their place. And I thought I'd just give you a kind of a summary of some of the things that excite me. I love technologies that drive energy efficiency and conservation. Refrigerators today use about 60% less energy than they used 10 years ago. When Boeing introduces the 787 later this year, it will be 25% more fuel efficient than the plane it replaces. Cars are more fuel efficient. I just think all the elements of conservation, innovation, this is a big way to get energy security for the future. And there's a lot of technology that drives that. I think technologies around natural gas are going to be big drivers in the future. This is one of the places where the U.S. can lead. We are long in natural gas, and I think it's going to have a big fit when you look forward in the future. Coal and coal technologies are always going to be important because it's a big part of the installed base. But most of that technology and innovation is going to be driven in China. Solar energy is quite compelling. We're big investors in solar energy. The cost of electricity is coming down. I think that actually is going to have a terrific fit. Wind and wind energy is going to be a big part of the grid going forward, mainly because it's more affordable today. We acquired Enron's wind business out of bankruptcy when Enron declared bankruptcy in 2002. We paid about $200 million for the business. It's generated about $5 billion of cash over the last 10 years. I've done a lot of dumb deals in my time. That wasn't one of them. I think wind is going to have a long-term fit. Nuclear, again, nuclear has been in operations for 50 years. I think clearly the world will learn a lot through the Fukushima incident. We'll see where nuclear goes, but I think it's a technology for the long term that needs to be a part of our portfolio. Electric vehicles, battery technology, I'd be long in batteries because I think both storage and battery technology are going to be very important. So there's a multitude, biofuels, there's a multitude of different technologies. The advantage I have running GE is I don't have to be smart enough to pick one. We can pick a bunch of them. The advantage I have versus a startup or an entrepreneur who has to focus in on thin film solar or offshore wind is I've kind of picked all of them, all of the above. And ultimately, technology is going to find its place to drive energy security, to reduce pollution. And I'm one of these people that completely believes that good innovation, good technology can create jobs, drive low cost of electricity, and reduce pollution at the same time. And that's ultimately what we have to do is do those three things. The fourth thing I tell you about energy is that investment in energy creates jobs. If you're in China, if you're in Europe, you believe that there will be somewhere around 15 million jobs created in clean energy investment. Utility CEOs in the US today believe there's somewhere between 3 and 4 million jobs that can be created by working on grid or new technology implementation on projects that get hung up in permitting and regulation. So every country in the world believes that energy investment, new energy technology is going to be a job creator. So it's not a dirty word to talk about clean technology or green energy. This is going to be one of the things that drives job creation over the long term. So big market, government plays a role, creates jobs, technology, diversity. The fifth thing is that scale is important. By the time Google became a public company, right, one of the most successful, if not the most successful startup in the history of the United States. By the time Google went public, the investment in Google was about $200 million. It takes $400 million to build a one subscale solar factory. So the scale involved in driving energy is massive. And it's one of the reasons why, in the past, the government has been a good proving ground of technologies like nuclear or engines or other technologies as a way to defray some of these startup and some of these scale costs. There's a big entrepreneurial community in Hanover. There's one of the things that the U.S. is great at is startups. I've seen startups be successful in the healthcare industry. Clearly, startups have dominated information technology. Startups will almost never dominate energy because the scale of producing cost, the reliability involved is massive. So that's why size of company and size of ideas really counts. 6, public policy really plays an important role long-term in deciding the success of technology and energy independence. And public policy can take a lot of different stages. It can be mandates. In other words, government can say, or EPA can say, that a certain percentage has to be driven by renewables. If you go to a place like Europe, basically the EU has decided that by 2020, 20% of the energy is going to be driven by renewables. So that's an example of a mandate. It can be driven by market pricing. Australia is going to put in a price for carbon. So you can use market pricing mechanisms. You can use a cap and trade, which exists in Europe. You can use environmental standards or mandates, which is a hybrid that's used in some of the states in the United States, some of the places in Europe. Government has a role in R&D and R&D funding and can help from an energy standpoint there. the point I'd make to you is that someday having some kind of energy concept in the U.S. isn't a horrible thing. These are, debates that need to take place. I don't think there's much of a appetite to do it today, but I do think that, having an idea of energy security, energy competitiveness, having a focus on pollution reduction over time, these are things that are really important. And I think to a certain extent, one of the things that's existed in the U.S. is with a lack of any standard, there's uncertainty. And if you're a utility CEO or a business person like I am, and you're trying to make a 30 or 20 or 10-year decision with no idea what the standards are going to be in 10 or 15 or 20 years, you don't invest. And that's basically what's happening in the U.S. today. GE has about 50% market share in the gas turbine industry, so we have about half of the world's market share. We'll make about 125 gas turbines this year, heavy-duty gas turbines. These are big turbines that will go into a utility. Something like 3 will go to the U.S. We'll sell more in Egypt in the middle of a civil war than we will in the United States this year. So I think this need for a public policy that I would start with security, cost, competitiveness, diversity, pollution reduction. And these things need to be decided, and we'll take bipartisan focus to get it done. But this is actually one of the things that ought to be on the top 4 or 5 of any legislative agenda as you look forward in the future. Right now, the country has no real appetite to do energy policy. Having watched the debt ceiling debate, I think you get a sense for that these are in the realm of things that are hard to do. And again, I think in many ways, by not having a policy, we create a policy, and that's a little bit about what we're living in right now. For instance, if you're a utility CEO, you know that no new coal plant is going to get permitted. So even though there's no policy, there's a de facto policy, and in some ways that's even worse. So there's an opportunity cost. I mean, the point I'd make here is, again, I have great respect and appreciation for what public policy is required and how hard it is to do energy policy, so I'm not being negative. But there's an opportunity cost in the fact that China has an energy strategy, Europe has an energy strategy, Japan has an energy strategy, so they're moving. And as other countries move, it reduces our ability to be able to lead over the next 10, 20, 30 years. And again, I think as a country, that's something we need to do. And by the way, I'm not here advocating for renewables or anything else. I personally believe that natural gas ought to be part of our future. I personally believe that we ought to drill in places safely like the Gulf of Mexico. So I'm not here to advocate any particular agenda. What I'm advocating for is really a set of standards, a set of ideas, a set of rules, a vision of where we can go in the energy field. And we just don't think that's going to be forthcoming anytime soon. But it's not an excuse not to go forward. So the 8th point I'd make is that in the absence of national ideas, what we'll have is ideas driven by states and ideas driven by companies. And with oil close to $100 a barrel, vacillating close to $100 a barrel, I think states will drive a multitude of different energy policies and renewable portfolio standards, and states can be places that we can experiment. And look, as a company, we are doubling down on clean technology and green energy. Look, in 2011, GE will have $21 billion of revenue of clean energy products, up from $5 billion in 2004. I mean, that's real money. So we continue to invest in solar energy, we continue to invest in wind, we continue to invest in electric vehicles, we continue to invest in conservation, we continue to invest in those things because we think it's going to allow us to be competitive long term. We can find customers, and most importantly, we can sell these products in China and in India and other places around the world that are investing in energy. So if I give you the things to think about, energy is big and important, big and important. The incremental buyer is not in the United States anymore. They're in China. So in many ways, China and India are driving demand as you look forward in the future, number one. Number two, even for those of us that are free market, market-driven capitalists, government plays a role in energy. Government plays a role in energy. So that's really important. Number three, if you're an investor, if you're an engineering student, if you're one of the students that's here today, go to work in the energy field. Go to work in energy technology. It's rich. It's dynamic. There's going to be a lot of jobs. It's going to be important. So technology is very open, and it's going to be very important. Number four, investing in energy creates jobs. And I would say that most other places around the world, if Europe is as tough an economy and broad base as there is anywhere in the world, they are creating jobs in the energy field. So jobs are important. Number five, scale. The thing that makes energy different than other dynamic industries is the fact that small players have a tough time competing over the long term. Number six, we need to have a focus on energy policy that ought to take a look at security, competitiveness, and global warming reduction. Number seven, this is hard, right? These are things where people need to reach compromise, so I don't think any of us are holding our breath to see any dynamic energy policy, but that's not an excuse. So number eight, I think we need to, as companies and as states, move forward. Now, the last two things I thought I'd talk about, because they have more to do with education and social ideas than anything else. One of the things that I always am talking to Carol and Jim about is producing students that know how to be what I call systems thinkers. You know, when I got here, I knew science and math, but I knew nothing about public policy. I knew nothing about a number of other things that were part of driving change. I really believe for the 20-year-olds that are, 22-year-olds that are coming through Dartmouth today, this is a generation that's going to be about problem solving. To be good problem solvers, you have to be what I call horizontal thinkers. You have to develop people that are comfortable with technology, public policy, globalization, working with people, building coalitions. And so I'm constantly cheering on for Carol, I'm cheering on for Jim to build horizontal learning, solutions-oriented learning, systems thinking, problem solving, because Lord knows we got plenty of problems to solve. And this is the way careers are going to be built. These are the way businesses are going to be built, and this is the way, Dartmouth students are going to drive good over the long term. So solutions and systems. The last thing I'd say is that I just talk about, kind of technology, science, and elitism. And the words don't have a lot to do with each other, but I thought I'd just give them some contrast. Unlike many Dartmouth people, I went through this place, and for most of my life, I could have cared less about the environment. Not at all. Wasn't a camper, wasn't an outdoorsman, never got in a canoe. My daughter, when she graduated from college, I made the mistake of telling her that anything she wanted to do, we'd do. And she picked climbing Mount Kilimanjaro, which we did. It was the first time I had ever been in a tent. So I don't talk about clean energy or wind energy from a context of ideology or environmentalism at all. One bit, none, zero, zippo. But I like math. I like science. I studied global warming. We had people in our research center. I studied global warming. We had a red team and a blue team. A red team that was supposed to defend why global warming was real. A blue team that was supposed to say, here's why it's junk science. And, I came to conclusions on my own. that it's real, it's caused by man, and it wasn't because I believed it, it's because I saw it and I thought it and I had the chance to think about it. So on one side, I say science helps, right? It's important to read things and study things. And I would urge everybody in this room not to be listening to me right now. Go read it on your own. Go build your own fact set. So one piece is science counts. The other piece is the reason why the country has not gelled towards change and clean energy is because it's viewed as elitist. Because it's viewed as a rich person's thought. It's viewed as a fancy thought. And none of us have done a good enough job of making it real, of making it work, of talking how it creates jobs, and making it practical. And instead, we've treated it like a burden or like a crime, and people don't, they don't get turned on by that. So I think ultimately, wherever you come from on the energy debate or the view of the environment is the extent to which the environment is viewed as precious, as viewed as an intellectual elitism, is not going to move forward. You're not going to win. You're right. And in the end, it doesn't matter all the time who's right or who makes the best argument. Life is about moving product. It's about doing stuff. It's about getting stuff done. That's in the end what categorizes who in the end does it. Who's willing to fight in the alleyway? Who's willing to push the idea? Who's willing to sell it? Who's willing to get a punch in the nose and come back? Life's about moving product, not about, putting stuff in a jar and a vase on your mantelpiece and saying, oh my God, look at this pretty, I'm cleaner than everybody else. Because let me tell you, there's a lot of people outside these doors who are going to punch you right in the nose. So science and elitism, I'm not sure I have a big point to make, but it's an interesting story. So that's everything I know about clean energy, and happy to take some questions. What Carol said is, I'm working with the president on Jobs Council, Jobs and Competitiveness Council. Clearly, it's an important topic. As you can tell, there's 26 of us. The approach we've taken is we're really building an industry-wide, sector-wide jobs plan. It's nonpartisan, and the extent to which it's possible, it's non-legislative, and it's action-oriented. And believe me, I've looked at it. There's not one silver bullet or not one big lever that's going to create jobs. If there was, somebody would have done it a long time ago. So this is literally, by the time it's done, it's going to be dozens of individual jobs plans that we're going to work on. Our approach has been to take, kind of catalyze first, take easy things first. Example. Country's lost 50% of its market share in global travel. If we can reduce the visa cycle time from 6 weeks to a week, we can create 200,000 jobs in the travel and leisure segment. Now, unless you can do stuff like that, you're not going to be able to do bigger ideas downstream. And we've got to build our confidence in this field. We've got to build some confidence and go forward in the future. What we're working on now is what we call bend the curve, infrastructure, U.S. investment, small business. Those are things where you can get 2 or 3 million jobs, I'm convinced, over time, if you pull the right levers. And then by the end of the year, we're going to take on things like regulatory, tax reform, things like that are going to be important. So, we're serious people. We're working hard. People are committed to it. It's clearly part of the national debate. I guess the impression I would want to give you is that this group of people is really dedicated. You had Judd Gregg, I think, who spoke a month or so ago about the Deficit Commission. I think they did a great job. Our plan is to really deliver a business plan to the president on jobs and competitiveness. And there's 26 of us that are taking this very seriously and are committed to the effort. So with that, Chuck, glad to join us. Thank you.
So as we begin our Q&A here, it's my job to remind you that for the sake of the rest of the audience, we'd like you to ask just one question. We'd like it to be relatively brief and succinct, and we'd like it to be a question, meaning that it's designed to elicit information and has a question mark at the end. And even though "isn't it true that" would technically have a question mark at the end, that doesn't quite cut it. So one of our customs here, since this has been a series that's going all summer, is we ask every guest to ask a question to the next guest. And in some ways, you're already ahead of us, but Hank Paulson was generous enough to come back last Thursday, and here is his question. He says, "My question is a simple one. Today, we've talked about our big need in this country being economic growth and jobs. And Jeff, you're serving right now as chairman of President Barack Obama's Jobs Council. So my question for you is, what do we need to do? What can be done in the short run to create jobs in this country? And more importantly, in the longer term, what do we need to do to maintain, regain our competitiveness and create jobs in the United States of America?"
So I'd say if you woke up tomorrow morning and you just said to yourself, the only thing I want to do today is create jobs. That whether I'm a Republican or a Democrat, I just want to create jobs. I think there's 3 or 4 things you'd do. You'd look at regulation permitting cycle. You'd look at some regulatory schemes that are retarding growth. And as importantly, you just look at things like cycle time. And you just say to every agency, okay, instead of 3 years, I'm going to give you a week to get this done. And I blast it through. I think you look at infrastructure. This country has a need. It's good in both the short and the long term. It's incredibly important for the future. There's 3 million unemployed construction workers. You're not going to make them software programmers. So you'd look at who the most unemployed are, and you'd put them to work, and infrastructure is a great place. I think the third thing is you'd look hard at training and retraining. You've got to find a way. There's somewhere between 300,000 and 400,000 open healthcare jobs right now. You'd find a way to get people trained to be radiology techs and things like that that can fill open jobs. So you'd work a piece on education. And then the fourth thing is small business. Small business has gotten crushed in this downturn, and you'd find a way to get financing to small business because they're not getting it today. And I think you just get up in the morning and you just very tactically, very specifically, in a very dogged way, work those things. And I think you'd get jobs. Over the longer term, look, I could talk about 1,000 different things over the longer term. The one I would talk about is education. I think we've got to get our mojo back as a country. And our confidence is such a big part of it. And if you feel you have the skills, if you feel you can do it, you can do it. And I got to tell you guys, I've been in every country in the world. There are many things that we can do here better than China and India and every place else. There are many places we compete. But you've got to burn with the fire of wanting to compete. You've got to, and I just think what's been lost is just education. You know, in other words, if you think you have the tools, let's go. You know, there's let's bring them on. Let's go. We can go. And I just think we have lost this spark and desire that bring on all comers. We can compete with anybody in the world. And my fear is what's driven that is you can't be number 26 in the world in math and number 27 in science. The unemployment among people that just have high school degrees is 30%. The unemployment for high school dropouts is obscene. So that's if I had to pick one thing over the long term to do, we got to get our mojo back. We got to get our sense for national competitive back. We've got to get our confidence back. But look, I have seen teams of people make jet engines, and they can kick anybody's butt anywhere in the world, and they do it right here in this country. And so I know it can be done.
So back on the environmental side, to most economists and policy types, the seemingly elegant solution is to put a price on carbon. I would also put that policy in the bucket of product we can't move, to use your very apt analogy. So if you could talk about that policy, and a little bit about the politics surrounding it, and then if that's simply not feasible right now, what are the next best options to address some of the environmental implications of any energy policy?
Look, I think the simplest way, like I said earlier, there's many techniques that you can use that can drive energy innovation and reduce pollution at the same time. An energy tax, a gas tax, is probably the simplest and really the most direct way to do it. And it's the way that it's really done in Europe in many ways, Japan in many ways, and it drives right behavior. Now, you're in the middle of a recession, and it happens to be this thing called TAX. And in case I've missed something recently, those don't seem to be going too well. So, you know, there might be other kind of compromises that might be, you know, combos of energy standards, clean energy standards with you know, credits that sunset over time, that stimulate technology, and R&D that doesn't go to companies like GE but goes to startups. You know, some combination of other things, not in today's environment, but as time goes on. The frustrating thing for me is, you know, in the end, when you run a company like GE, we can do this anywhere, right? You know, and so if we don't like to do it here, I could do it in Poland, or I could do it in Germany, or I could do it in South Africa. I can invest in these technologies anywhere. And if we don't want to do these things, we're not ever going to be able to be the leader in these things. And some have already moved away. You know, I just, you know, I don't know what your opinion is on nuclear power. Again, personally, I'm for it. I think it's going to take some time, but already that has left this country. All the technologies around the coal have already left this country. I'd say by and large, solar is already someplace else. Battery technology in the balance. So it's not like the rest of the world sits there and says, okay, let's wait until the US gets its energy policy, then we'll decide what to do. If you're in Beijing, you're saying, okay, let's move fast because they're not doing anything. We can go quickly, and that's the opportunity cost we get with where we are right now. But again, I'm going to keep going. You know, a lot gets mentioned that business isn't investing because of uncertainty. I think that's rubbish. I don't need the government to do anything to make me invest. And believe me, the rest of the world isn't that stable either. You know, so I've made my own choices. We've made our own choices that we're going to keep investing regardless of what happens in Washington.
Harking back to an earlier lecture, we had Buddy Roemer announce his presidency on campus, then came and did a lecture afterwards. I don't think he knew that you were coming, but he was quite harsh on GE for not paying corporate income tax in the United States. So many of these people were here, so I'd like to give you an opportunity to answer that. And then more broadly, just talk about the U.S. corporate income tax, which most people...
Well, how's his campaign gone so far?
Well, that was the last we heard of him.
Okay, so that's funny. Look, GE has paid tens of billions of dollars of taxes over the last decade. Our tax rate in 2011 is 41% year to date. It'll be in excess of 30% this year. Our technique for paying low taxes in 2009 and 2010 was writing off $32 billion in our financial service business. I don't recommend it. But all that being said, if you look forward, I think corporate tax in this country needs to be reformed. I think Judd Gregg probably talked about it. I thought what the Deficit Commission came up with, which was a lower corporate tax rate ending every loophole, is what we would take with a territorial system, we would take in a heartbeat. The fact is, I'd take Germany's or Japan's or UK's corporate tax policy today. Without any dispute, I would take any of those tax policies versus the US today. You know, and look, we live in a time, criticism is what it is, and I don't blame people who just read it on face value for being critical of GE, even Buddy. You know, it is what it is, right? And I understand why people pay attention to it and why they care about it, but the story's more subtle than that, you know, and that's what frequently doesn't get described. Now look, 60% of our revenues outside the United States, 70% of our backlog, we're the country's biggest exporter. Now, I wish all our customers were in Chicago. It's easier, but they're not. My customers are in Egypt and Abu Dhabi and Moscow and Beijing and Bangalore, and that's where we have to go sell our gas turbines and jet engines, right? So we are the world's biggest commercial aviation jet engine manufacturer. 10% of those products are in the United States. 90% are outside the United States. I don't want you to root against us. That's not taking jobs out of the United States. That's being an export. That's what we have to do. And so in some ways, we've gotten this psychotic thing that anybody that does business outside the United States is a heathen, anti-American. That's crap, okay? And in many ways, I don't understand why we're rooting against companies that are out there competing, because we're creating good jobs here. You know, like I said, 125 gas turbines, 3 in the US. We employ 3,000 people in Greenville, South Carolina making gas turbines. 0 of their products are sold in the United States, 3,000. So let's go compete. And, you know, when Angela Merkel flies in an airplane from Berlin to Beijing, 20 CEOs get off right behind her. 20 CEOs. And she's there saying, yeah, okay, Germany, buy from Siemens. Don't buy from GE. And that's my world. So I just think, look, big companies can get criticized, and a lot of criticism is deserved, and it is what it is. But I think the desire to compete, don't take that away from us. Don't take that away from us.
Terrific. We will turn to the audience. If I call on you, please wait for the microphones, which will be coming down the aisle. And I will remind you again to stay succinct. So, right here.
Faster, faster.
Mr. Immelt, I was curious about your regulatory overhaul that you mentioned earlier. And I actually had the opportunity to intern at the Jobs Council, so I know how important it is to shorten permitting times in order to make it more effective. But bringing it back to the environment and the EPA specifically, I was wondering, other than shortening permitting time periods as well as, or permitting cycles rather, and in addition to providing research and development, are there any specific recommendations you have for making us more competitive in energy, yet maintaining high environmental standards?
Yeah, look, I mean, I think there is a job the EPA has to do, which is mandated by law. And so I'm not advocating to break the law. I think that there are permitting cycle times that just are purely bureaucratic. And the fact is that, you know, if you're doing a cross state line gas pipeline, it takes 4 years. If you're doing an electricity grid, it takes 7 years. That seems a bit tardy to me. And then I think let's pick 3. Let's pick drilling off the Gulf of Mexico. Let's take the Trans-Canada pipeline that goes from the oil sands in Canada down to the United States, and let's pick shale gas. Now, I think there should be rules for all of those. I don't think people should be able to just do whatever they want to do. There should be rules for all of those. But we should be doing them all. You know, in other words, the role of a regulator, be it the FDA or the EPA or anybody else, is how to make it safe. It's not to flip an on or an off switch. Now, this country could be an exporter of natural gas. We have more natural gas than almost any other country in the world. Why not celebrate that? You know, we've been doing shale gas in Pennsylvania for a decade. There's 150 environmental laws that you have to adhere to do shale gas discovery in Pennsylvania today. Do we need 300? So, I'm not anti-EPA. I'm really not. I actually think in some ways the EPA drives good standards. And those standards are important for competitiveness, and those standards create an equal playing field. But I think today, we've let some agencies run with no accountability at all. None. And I think that may have been okay when unemployment was 5%. It may have been okay some other time. But I think if we're making everybody else accountable, the FDA and the EPA and everybody else should be as well. Not to lower standards, but to set standards, and then let's live with them. And let's not pick winners and losers. Let's go. So I'm not anti-regulator. I'm not anti-rule. What I'm for is the fact that we ought to set the standards and get out of the way and let innovation take over. What you really want to do is we want to be cheering for people like Exxon to do this safely, to create jobs and to create energy security, not trashing them. And I just think, look, everybody had to wake up post-financial crisis and play a different game. Everybody had to. And to a certain extent, you know, I mean, we only own 49% of NBC right now, so I can actually say this. My advice to you is don't watch TV. You know, my advice to you is your life would be better if you didn't watch TV or read the paper. Because in many ways, you know, these are just concentric rings. You know, what we're living through this week in Europe or whatever today's crisis is, has its genesis in the financial crisis that actually started in 2007. We're in our 4th year of volatility. And everybody had to wake up. Everybody has to realize as we're going through this, you got to change. Washington has to, GE has to, and the EPA has to. And that's how I look at it.
More questions? Casey?
Hi. I was wondering if stealing of technology over the web, which they've talked about China doing a lot of, is that a threat to business? Is that something that you think of a lot?
Absolutely. No, look, I think for GE, we spend somewhere between $6 and $7 billion of R&D on R&D every year. We file somewhere between 2,000 and 3,000 patents every year. So protecting intellectual property is really important. And there's not one investment decision that we make that I don't personally approve outside the United States. You know, the fact is that China today is developing a lot of its own technology. And the more they invest in R&D, the more that they have more to lose when R&D isn't adhered to. So I actually think this is something that's changing over time and the standards are improving. But intellectual property protection is something I guard very seriously and think a lot about.
Why don't we go in the back, right in the middle there, please.
To supply India and China with the products from GE, are they all manufactured in this country by American workers?
So if you take a look, you know, product by product, if you look at jet engines, aviation products, they're all fundamentally manufactured here and exported to China and India and every place else, Russia, Europe, every place else. Energy, if you look at the very big frame gas turbines, those are all manufactured here. If you look at lower scale products, lower megawatt products, a lot of those are localized in China and India and are done in those countries. So we have a very global footprint. We make and sell things every place in the world, but the high-tech, high-end products are manufactured here. Now, if you walk through a GE factory, basically, I'm going to be tomorrow at our aviation factory in Mississippi, right? 435 workers, one manager. All self-directed teams, reducing cycle time. We've taken probably 80% of the cycle time and how to manufacture a jet engine. The hourly people probably make, I don't know, 25 bucks an hour, something like that. So high paid, high trained, efficient, and we can make those products and compete with anybody in the world because we have a well-educated, productive workforce.
Right, Michael.
Given that everyone seems to care exclusively about job creation right now, can you see a reason why the Supercommittee shouldn't expand its mandate and implement the actionable strategies that you just outlined that the Presidential Jobs Council on Competitiveness has come up with, such as the infrastructure building or regulatory reform?
Look, I think the Gang of 12 is going to have a very narrow mandate on budget and tax policy. I think as time goes on, you know, as the Jobs Council gets more underway and more mature, these are going to be very public ideas. And my own belief is that you're exactly right, that there should be a context in which we talk about budget deficit vis-a-vis job creation. And I think we need to keep these two debates very close at hand. You know, we're into some uncharted waters right now. But, you know, the UK took a very stark budgetary approach, and they're seeing very negative results in unemployment right now. And so I think, again, there's going to be balance required as we approach these very important decisions that need to be made. And again, I would urge everybody in this room to read the Simpson-Bowles Commission report, whether you're a student or a faculty member, because I actually think you had a great group of people who did this work, and what they presented was fairly balanced and extremely well thought through. And I hope in some ways that's where we get to.
Well, we assigned Simpson-Bowles. Whether they read it or not is beyond my control.
Well, I always read everything when I was a student.
Why don't we go right?
My advice to you, I was studying
right
away
there in the green
every
shirt.
night. It's really terrible.
Evergreen Energy went bankrupt this week, and Patrick Duvall took his lumps, or is taking his lumps, for the state funding of Evergreen. Rush followed up by saying 2 or 3 others energy people have gone bankrupt within the last month. What can be done to safeguard the funds of the taxpayer in putting money into these operations?
You know, it's a great question. Look, anytime you're in the investing business, whether you're a business or you're the government, it's a risk-taking enterprise, and not everybody's going to make it. And so I think in some ways, a lot of the ideas that were put forth in the stimulus are great ideas. And by the way, I don't personally think GE should get this funding. I think it should go to small business. But if you fund, let's say, 40 battery companies, I can tell you with 100% certainty, 40 battery companies aren't going to make it. I can tell you that with exactly 100% certainty. So I think there needs to be more thoughtfulness, and in some ways, government is not always going to be the best investment vehicle, you know, for how these decisions get made. Now, look, I think solar is a particularly tough, you know, the sad fact about energy that's different than healthcare. I ran our healthcare business for 5 years. You know, in healthcare, you always had to be best in breed. In energy, you don't have to be best in breed. You just need to be big and fast. You know, we bought, as I said, Enron's wind business. We went from being a terrible company to being #1 in 6 years. It's not that we did anything special, but you know, we were GE. We had scale, we had size, we had reliability, we had a lot of other things going for us. And what makes energy so tricky is that there's just a lot of those bad bets that are going to be made. So I don't, you know, there are better ways maybe for the government to do incentives versus doing direct investment in companies, you know, that can do a better job of driving market behaviors so that the most competitive have a chance to be successful.
Well, we are remarkably out of time, but you have a chance to ask a question now, so I have to give you the background. Next Tuesday, we have Frank Newport coming in, editor-in-chief of Gallup. And we spoke in class, we spoke here obliquely about our broken political system. But of course, a lot of that reflects anxieties and other public opinions and so on. So if you could ask him a question about public opinion right now that affects either your business or your work with the Jobs Council, what would it be?
I'd ask him, is there really anybody in the middle anymore? And if there is, why doesn't anybody seem to care about them? That's what I'd ask him.
Terrific. Thank you very much. It's been absolutely terrific.
Great, thanks. Thank you.